Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with us. We had a couple of technical issues at the in the last 10 minutes. I'm Kristen Poore. I'm a curator here at Arts and Letters. We are thrilled to welcome you to this roundtable conversation today, celebrating the launch of the Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism. This is part of our new exhibition and event program. And since September, we have begun a new pace of programming here, led by our chief curator, Jenny Jasky. And we are very, very happy that the galleries are now open year-round. And we have the exhibitions that you've seen next door and upstairs, as well as concerts, talks, and performances. So come back, please. And be sure to join our mailing list if you haven't already, so you can hear about what's coming up in the new year, including our next exhibitions, which open in March. Those are exhibitions with painter Teresa Baker and photographer and filmmaker El Perez. So thank you all, too, for bearing with us with the cold temperatures today. We're obviously having some boiler issues. And please help yourselves to the hot tea and the other beverages that are out there as we go through the talk today. So before I introduce Kieran Finlayson and the excellent panel that he's put together for us today, I'd like to start by acknowledging Arts and Letters member Charles Gaines, who curated the exhibition. Charles curated the exhibition, The Theater of Refusal in 1993, and Catherine Lord, who edited the original publication. So thank you both for being here today. I'd also like to thank the co-editors of the new publication, who are, in addition to Charles Gaines, Rhea Anastas, Jamila James, and Eric Gullo-Stone. And Rhea is also the curator of the excellent Christine Kozlov exhibition upstairs, which will be on view until February. So if you haven't had a chance yet to see it, please do come back. And then I'd also like to thank Karen Kelly and Barbara Schroeder of Dancing Foxes Press for making this beautiful book. And letting us share this exciting moment with you. Thank you. And then finally, I'd like to thank the Art Committee and the board and the members of Arts and Letters for supporting this program. Arts and Letters is led by our members, and this is a place where artists support artists, which I think we can all agree is a beautiful thing. So please be sure to get your copy of The Theater of Refusal today. It will be available during and after the talk. And now I will briefly introduce Kieran, who will in turn introduce the other participants. Kieran Finlayson is a writer and editor based in New York. He is senior editor at Triple Canopy and the author of Perpetual Slavery, which was published last year by Floating Opera. Thank you, Kieran, for bringing this wonderful group together, and thank you all for being here. With that, please join me in welcoming Kieran and today's speakers.
Hi, thank you all for coming today. It's an honor to be moderating this roundtable celebrating the new edition of Charles Gaines and Catherine Lord's publication, The Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism. I want to thank Rhea and Kristen for inviting me to be part of this and making the event come together. Thanks also to Noah Wellesley and the rest of the team at the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And thanks, of course, to Charles Gaines and Catherine Lord for bringing the book into the world. I'm going to give a bit of background about the book and publication before introducing today's panel. The Theater of Refusal was an exhibition conceived by Charles Gaines in 1989. It was initially to be titled Black Art and Postmodern Aesthetics and held at Krieger Landau Gallery in Los Angeles, but the gallery folded before the project could be realized. The same happened with Security Pacific Gallery in Costa Mesa. It took 4 years for the idea to find a home at the Fine Arts Gallery of the University of California, Irvine, where the curator Catherine Lord championed it. These were the days of the California recession and the multicultural boom in the contemporary art sphere. The economic contraction and cultural expansion gave new context for the concept. In 1992, Rodney King was beaten by the Los Angeles Police Department, and the ensuing LA rebellion reconfigured the terrain of national and cultural politics. Footage of the beating was selected by John Hanhart for inclusion in the 1993 Whitney Biennial, an exhibition that loosed a torrent of discourse across the pages of art periodicals and newspapers concerning politics in museums and the preponderance of so-called grievance art. By the time of the Whitney Biennial, Gaines had already written his substantial essay on the relation of postmodern theory to Black art, and all of the artists he had hoped to include in the show had become major figures. There had been an explosion of shows about the state of Black art. Theory, meanwhile, had already spread like wildfire throughout the art world in the 1980s, and it was now time to take stock. Gaines's essay intended to come to terms with the promises and limitations of this discursive field for understanding the situation facing Black artists at the end of the decade. He had selected an eclectic group of artists to examine: Jean-Michel Basquiat, Renee Green, David Hammonds, Benjamin Patterson, who's part of the roundtable, Adrian Piper, Sandra Rowe, Gary Simmons, Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, Pat Ward-Williams, and Fred Wilson. These artists exemplified a range of conflicting approaches to the pressing questions of minority discourse and, quote, unified ethnicity. The reception of their work exemplified the contradictions present in the critical discourse. Gaines and Lord made the decision to present this heterogeneous group of Fluxus conceptual assemblage, photography, and installation works alongside excerpts of art criticism that were mounted on the wall. They shared this research in the form of charts, which you can see in the images, and binders in a reading room where visitors could read the texts in full. By bringing the practice and discourse of art together into the gallery, Gaines demonstrated their convergence. As Jacques Rancière might say, they introduced into the very life of the artworks the infinite task of critique that alters them. French theory properly hit the American art scene in 1981 with the translation of Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation, and this kind of torrent of post-68 philosophy that followed displaced the American paradigm of Greenbergian modernism. So Gaines was coming to terms with all of this and whether postmodernism was a trap, as Adrian Piper had alleged, a scheme for depriving racial minorities and women of legitimate claims to the historically progressive forces of logic, reason, autonomy, and meaningful political subjectivity. Simultaneously, a new generation of countercultural artists had begun producing French-style theory and imbibing the lessons of earlier conceptual art, while newspapers and magazines were proceeding as though nothing had taken place. Discussion of multiculturalism dominated in the early 90s, and the title essay in the book critiques both multiculturalism's detractors and its defenders. The former were found to be trafficking in the most base forms of anti-intellectual stereotyping and responding defensively to work that they could not understand. The latter tended to foreshorten the meaning of the work that it purported to celebrate by hindering the work's capacity to mean anything beyond what might be expected of it based on the identity of the artist. So the remarkable book that came out of this exhibition, Gaines writes, the title suggests that the critical environment surrounding the works of these artists intentionally and unintentionally limits those works, creating a theater of refusal that punishes the work of Black artists by making it immune to history and by immunizing history against it. That the book was made in the first place is a marvel, considering that the show was hosted at a university gallery an hour and a half outside of LA. In addition to essays by Gaines and Lord and Maurice Berger, it featured a expansive roundtable with a group of critics, curators, and artists, including Gaines and Lord, Hilton Owls, Thelma Golden, Lizetta LaFell Collins, Benjamin Patterson, Sandra Rowe, Gary Simmons, and Pat Ward Williams. And the new edition of this book that we're celebrating today includes a complete facsimile of the original, minus Adrian Piper's contribution. Discourses on race and marginalization have shifted such that she now no longer allows her work to be presented in the context of all Black exhibitions, which she considers a form of racial segregation. The 2024 version includes a major essay by Fred Moten, and Moten in conversation with Gaines, Gaines in conversation with Lord, and statements from the artists Kemi Adeyemi, Malik Gaines, Stephanie Jemison, Will Rawls, Cameron Rowland, and Colleen Smith. So the role of theory, the questions that it asks, the status of the critic, the position of print culture, the demographic compositions of the art world, all of these have undergone major changes since 1993. The art world and the capitalist system itself have become more intensely transnational. Black social movements have rattled the country several times over in the intervening decades, producing decisive changes not only in politics, but in the compositions of mastheads, staff roles, board seats. So to discuss these questions and more, I'm joined today by the curator Jamila James, who co-edited the 2024 edition of the Theater of Refusal, and three multidisciplinary artists, Aria Dean, Andros Sins Brown, and Christian Nyampata. Charisse Perlina Weston, who is supposed to join us, is unfortunately unable to be here today. Each will make a brief remark before we have about 20 minutes of group discussion, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, hi. I've already forgotten what I'm supposed to do to get to my slides. Okay, sorry. Hi, I'm Aria Dean. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Karen, and thank you to everyone at the Academy for having us, and thank you to Charles and Catherine for, thank you, doing this in the first place, such that there's something to comment on. And I guess I should say, I know, as a sort of almost preamble to my very short preamble, Theater Refusal, I think I stumbled across the catalog for it in the Oberlin College Library like my sophomore year randomly. Hadn't really heard about it, and it was a hugely influential resource to me in that period and has been since. So it's a real honor to get to talk about it and very exciting to revisit it in 2024. Also, I'm a bit sick, so just bear with me, and sorry if I sneeze. Anyway, so I just have a few slides. I will go quickly, just a few comments on each. So this is, a screenshot of Simone Lee's Venice Biennial project. I guess I just wanted to show a few different major artists as I spoke about sort of what I think is going on now. In terms of these questions around marginalization and exclusion, I guess the first thing I'd say is, we've seen two Black artists that represented the U.S. at the Venice Biennial in a row, Simone Lee and, oh my God, I'm pressing down. Sorry. Oh yeah, upside down. Thank you. Okay, and Martin Puryear as well. And so I guess just sort of to open up a question around, if the situation has shifted and Black artists representing the U.S. on the world stage in this way, what does that mean? It's obviously not some sort of utopian moment. There's a sort of being conscripted into representing the nation at large. And then Puryear, when he did his pavilion, talked about this phrase, the citizen artist, as well. And so I guess there's this tension that clearly remains in 2024 between being an artist as like any other and being a quote unquote Black artist. So those are just two examples, I guess, to think about, just centering Black art in that way. This is Andrea Fraser's exhibition. I think it was 2022 or early 2023. At Marion Goodman. I thought this was sort of funny to include, and that exhibition featured this video that was Fraser reenacting this sort of roundtable that I believe was a bunch of all white women talking about their racial biases, their feelings around Blackness, race in general, and this was very much the sort of post George Floyd moment. So I guess in terms of thinking about what has changed and what we're dealing with in the current art world, and thinking a lot about 2020 as a moment of sort of a sea change, not necessarily in terms of some amazing new paradigm for Black art, but Black Lives Matter and George Floyd being a clear moment that must be considered in terms of thinking about not only the politics of representation, what kinds, but also just the actual economics of the art world, but also sort of not necessarily decentering whiteness as a sort of universal subjectivity, but something weird happening where you started seeing all white people reading these books about white fragility and making exhibitions about white fragility, and so kind of some sort of reorganization of subjectivities. And I think that I don't know, I guess something I wrote down too is I think there's just a need for a sort of new analysis of power related to that sort of this, I guess, even in terms of actual official politics, this sort of invocation of victimhood and, American protectionism and these sorts of things becoming, I don't know, using the language of identity politics as well. I will move very quickly. And then this is Arthur Jafa's project from last year, where I'm sure many of us saw in New York, where he sort of flipped or deturned or whatever the ending of Paul Schrader, Taxi Driver. And I guess I'm also just thinking about, I'm showing major artworks by major artists, thinking about who've been the big, winners or the voices that have been quite loud in this period. I also worked for AJ for a number of years. And so I guess I wanted to show this because I think this project, was the first moment also that I think I heard a lot of people kind of being like, I didn't love it, I think, with regard to AJ. And so I think that's interesting if we're going to have sort of serious conversations about, I don't know, what we want artwork by Black artists to do, or by artists in general. And I think also I brought this up to sort of maybe think through, there's a question around like dialectical or non-dialectical thinking in the roundtables and the conversations in the original book. And so I think that this sort of post-Afro-pessimism theoretical thread in a lot of Black art kind of tries to negotiate with a sort of like dialectical thing with like Blackness and whiteness. I have a lot more to say on that, but I won't. And then this is Cameron Rowland's plot at DIA currently, which I really enjoyed. And I think also kind of, I guess I'm thinking just put it up in terms of what interests me both as an artist and a critic right now. It's, I think, work by Black artists that also tries to comment directly on or think through value, specifically like economic value, cultural value, and work upon that, not just conscript objects into narrativizing Blackness in, again, these ways that are already kind of accepted. And I know also, Karen, you wanted me to sort of speak to being artist and critic, and I guess and this question of theory. I think that just, I'll say, I think theory is really important insofar as it brings ideas into art. And I do think, again, with this idea around analyzing how power operates, I'm not sure how one does that without historical tools that usually pop up in theoretical writing. So that's it.
Hi, my name is Andrew Sins-Brown. Thank you to the Academy and to Charles and Catherine, Dancing Foxes, Kieran, panelists. Great to be here with you. I kind of came, like, one of the prompts of, like what our relationship is to criticism kind of led me to quite a few stumblings or like roadblocks where I was like, what is my relationship to criticism? Do I have a relationship to criticism? Do I want to have a relationship to criticism? My practice, I come from dance and performance. And reading the Roundtable from '93, I really felt like I could relate to the frustrations that the artists were expressing about feeling marginalized, being disrespected, being misnamed, being basically ignored by serious art critics. But I felt like the ways that I could relate to it had less to do with my race, being a Black artist, and more to do with the fact that I make performance and make dance. And dance and performance have kind of historically always been that form of marginalization, as far as the ways that it doesn't behave well as a commodity, and therefore gets largely ignored in criticism, even though, of course, we all know there are a lot of incredibly serious, incredibly deep researching artists who are working in performance and dance. So, I came to this question like, do I care about this? Is dance and performance in some ways the new Black? Is it maybe just the old Black, because it's always been that way? Where is the theater of refusal meeting the refusal of theater? And do I want to care about it? Because more or less, I'd say, for better or worse, I've ignored it and it's ignored me. So, dance criticism generally happens in a space where the reader reads it at a time that it's already gone and disappeared. And so I also get it. Like, what is the point? I expressed all those kind of concerns to Kieran when we spoke. And I was like, I don't know, Kieran, like something about it feels a little bit cynical. Like, I don't want to get up on this and like just, bash on dance criticism. And Kieran very generously said, cynical is cool. That's great. Come bring your cynicism. And I came back to it and I was like, okay, but something else. Like, so I thought, and I'll just kind of like very quickly try to go through what I did come to is my relationship to criticism, or at least where I'm like more interested in criticism, has to do with what potentials we as artists might have to critique each other's work, insofar as like critique isn't a judgmental space. It isn't like a kind of cul-de-sac that you like get to the end and you have to, turn back. But that opens new connections and new ecosystems between artists. So one strain of my work has been to work in remixes and remixing works of other artists. And that's felt like a vital and also generative space of critique. So here you see Simone Forti's 1960 performance Seesaw with Yvonne Rainer and Steve Paxton. Oh, sorry, Robert Morris actually is performing here with Yvonne Rainer. And here, 2019, MoMA did their Judson show. So here, Will Rawls and I did a remix, and I'm happy to talk about any of these projects in further depth another time. This is Jerome Bell's 1995 performance titled Jerome Bell. And I did a remix in 2020 from Cadis Foundation and eFlux. And with all of these, I felt like I was able to like revisit these works and see where their limitations may have been, and also where the historical fabric of it folded back for me in the moment. This is Tony Koch's recent installation at Dia Bridgehampton, and Tony Koch's remixes that I did in the same space in 2023. And then, yes, we come to the gentle giant in the room, Charles Gaines. So some of you are probably familiar with this incredible work of Charles, this 110-foot-long sculpture called Moving Chains that was installed on Governor's Island. I visited the site and knew that I wanted to do something that could be inhabited in that work, and also feeling the weight, the literal physical weight, the historical weight of that space. I felt like I wanted to make something that specifically exited it, and that felt very important for me. And what ensued was a performance called Dual C, which took place inside of the sculpture with audience on both sides, and also departed. And in this work, there were a lot of dialectics, I think, in Charles' work that had to do with the kind of legacies of chattel slavery, and for sure ways that resonates with the carceral state. Some of the people that I worked with in this project were coming from jail, actually. And there were a lot of ways that we wanted to think together about how to find a space that was outside of dialectics of care and violence, but where there should be one more, but there is not. Well, you can imagine someone at the top of a hill with a hula hoop looking at the Statue of Liberty, and I'll just leave it there.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here and to be in the room. Yes, so my name is Christian Yampeta, and I'm nervous because it's a daunting task a little bit to think about to think with and speak towards artists and people I look up to. So the book, which is how first I learned about the exhibition, I spent quite a good amount of time browsing through obscure online bookshops, and I once came across the book, but unfortunately it was too expensive to acquire. So I'm very happy that it's now here, and even more happy that I was invited by Kieran to reflect on it. So my position from which I would like to reflect needs a little bit of talking about, a little bit of elucidation, because it is a position made of many movements. So it is a moving and errant condition. So I grew up in Rwanda, where I was born, and my citizenship is Dutch because I came of age there in the Netherlands, and I was educated in England, where I studied under Kojo Eshin, among others, of the Otolit group, who, I suppose, on a question of criticism, he might say that criticism is a sign of love sometimes. And but now I live here in New York, where I also work. And so I'm mentioning all of this because these, let's call them sociographic, to use Sylvia Wynter's term, movements actually complicate the question of criticism, which I believe relies on stabilizing a position from which to speak. So once I wrote an essay, I'm not sure if it was criticism, but it appeared in a book called Thinking Art, published by the Kingston University in London. And it was published during the pandemic, so it has that cachet of a somewhat like insular but distributed thought, if you like. And so I was reflecting a little bit on what art is, contemporary art in particular, and I wanted to say that previously, so before the onset of that, still, I think, ongoing convergence of crisis, the question of what contemporary art is could have been addressed by looking at when contemporary art is accessible. So contemporary art had been the artworks that wider publics and audiences scarcely encounter before noon and rarely past 6 p.m. 9 p.m. on selected days and of the week. In other words, the contemporary art preserved, mandated, and conserved by the gallery and the museum is barely lived with. And I was already fascinated by something akin to the sociology of the quotidian of such artworks that is not lived with. Again, I'm mentioning all of this because most of the work I've done is somewhat concerned with the question of how to live together, in particular in the wake of radical rupture, as Rwanda and East Africa has endured to this day. And so, because the question of an artwork somewhat sets itself against the background from which it emerges. So this emergence being a process of social, cultural, and sometimes, when successful, economic detachment. So in turn, this detachment is what distinguishes an artwork from other artworks, but also from, let's say, work in general. This emergence from the background is essentially a reference. And so in a position like my own, which is really made of quite a number of references, it makes it hard to be a subject of maybe even criticism, because it goes hand in hand with maybe inability to locate what the actual discipline is. And I think this is is not only particular to myself, but I would say to artists who are somewhat between nations. And I would say that Black artists are also between nations, in a way that there exists a nation under the United States, which is, but that's not exactly my position to speak from, which is what I try to sketch. But instead, I wanted to mention more that in contrast to this specific maybe condition of contemporary art, another hat that I wear is more in film, and in particular African cinema, which I organize and produce sometimes and convene in different ways. And there, the question of criticism, which comes close to that of contemporary art is slightly different in that it's a space which requires the making of its own audiences in such a way that the critics often are those who are also making and teaching, so that ultimately the if we were maybe to put those two worlds in parallel, I would say that African art and maybe cinema, which was one of the prompts I received, is compositional, which is again a return to that essay I mentioned, as opposed to referential. And maybe I'll leave to that and hope you'll come back to it.
Hi, everyone. I first want to say thank you to Catherine and Charles for making this very important text and exhibition. Also to Rhea and Eric for making this new edition of the book possible. Also Dancing Foxes, the Academy, and my co-panelists and Kyron. I'm the curator perspective on this panel, and I'd like to respond directly to a prompt that Kyron gave me about my relationship to the exhibition and to the text, and what is the state of being a curator now in this moment after the last several years. I admittedly came to Theater of Refusal very late, and I wish that had not been the case, but it is. It's part of what Thelma Golden called the miseducation that happens with curators and artists, and how selective art history can be, and what we do learn about can be. I've said often recently that when I was in school, I only learned about maybe 5 Black artists, which is a travesty. And it's exhibitions like Theater of Refusal that are important correctives to that. Theater is often cited along with the 93 biennial as touchstones for curators working in its wake. Black curators, of which there are many more than there were 30 years ago, but also some of our select compatriots. Curating itself is a form of critique, and in rereading the text for today, I was struck by how little has actually changed in regards to the language or lack thereof. There is a speak about the work of Black artists and also the work of Black curators, even those who don't work specifically with Black artists as their specialty. I've worked as an independent curator and at several institutions, some of which have had their own issues as it pertains to how well they can support a curator, a Black curator within that space, and how their work can be framed through the lens of history and external social considerations. Museums are often thought of as vacuums immune to the forces of the outside world and the public scrutiny and opinion. There have been several watershed moments, as we all know, starting from the continuum of the Rodney King verdict, the LA uprisings, to most recently the murder of George Floyd, the 2020 uprisings, the pandemic, the first Trump administration, the soon-to-be second Trump administration, and the global rise of right-wing sentiment and autocracy. The assembly of these contexts have reframed the role of the institution. Artists have always had a way of responding to the moment, but curators and museums are increasingly called upon to examine their own responsibilities to the public and culture. There is a new form of criticism that's emerged, which is the public being more empowered to speak back to the perceived power that is the museum and curators by proxy. Some recent examples include protests and calls to action regarding the conflict in Gaza, the Sacklers, and more specific instances such as the race-related controversies at the 2014 and 2017 Whitney Biennials. One of the ongoing discourses, which Thelma Golden, who's played a defining role in cultivating and mentoring Black curators, myself included, is the inclusion in museums beyond its program and acquisition strategy of Black curators and workers, not just to its staffing choices, also to its other staffing choices in other departments that have historically been white, and also to museum governance. Since 2020, there's been a crush of interests in diversifying institutions, and in some respects, it could be considered an overcorrection, which has not been well addressed in recent years. One of the things that comes to mind with reading the roundtable this morning was, are Black curators now the mainstream themselves, not just the museums that they work for? I've heard some grumblings to that effect, unsurprisingly, and also that Black curators take up too much space to the exclusion of curators of other identities, white or other POCs. The role of curators and what we do in museums remains misunderstood, under scrutiny, instrumentalized. I should mention Black curators, remains misunderstood, under scrutiny, instrumentalized, subject to ridiculous expectations regarding the content of our work and what we represent, or held to impossible standards. And yet this cycle will also continue for the next minority group that the art world will fixate on. I've gone to great pains myself to try to evade these expectations placed on me because I'm a Black woman and a Black curator, but not a Black curator. As much as things have changed for Black artists with heightened visibility and better opportunities, though in a better, though still imperfect critical landscape, and by extension, Black curators, however few in proportion there are to the greater field, the things such as lack of partnership and advocacy from our peers still surface as major concerns. And admittedly, I'm also very, very tired of what we still have to endure 30 years later.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, maybe we'll just begin with in the original roundtable, Hilton Owls and Thelma Golden are very lively discussants, and they're both very vocally kind of exasperated about the prompt. Even in '93, they're already saying that discussions of exclusion and marginalization are redundant. I guess I'm wondering, it seems to me this poses a question about the metrics for measuring exclusion today. If we are to speak about Black art in these terms, how do we measure it? But then I guess the question would be what tools we have. Assuming the discussion is still worth having, what tools we have to have a non-redundant discussion of the topic.
I can go. Sick and stuff, but I mean, I guess like one thing I thought about with regard to that is, I mean, yeah. So this question of like, I mean, even what in my little preamble, like exclusion, marginalization. I guess I find myself more interested in thinking about like extraction. I mean, I think also to what Jamila was saying about like there's this like, you know, there was or maybe still is this like there was a rather sudden like a fixation on Black artists, and I think that I'm sure that there are many artists who are continuing to be excluded and maybe still feel that way or feel marginalized within the institutional landscape. But I guess like sort of like if you think structurally, I don't know that that's so much the case. But what the art world has gotten really good at is extracting the I don't know, yeah, I guess the labor, and then also just like all the work that's been done in sort of like these maybe more marginal spaces, now kind of like shoving them into the spotlight. And so I guess I've struggled to figure out how to analyze like what one does in that situation. Like, of course, like the art world is really a market also. So then like, of course, it's extractive, but you know what, I'm not sure, what correctives there are in that new situation. But.
Yeah, maybe from two perspectives. One, if we think again about maybe what the phenomenon of art really is, which I think means different things for different people. But if we maybe for now engage in a theoretical exercise, by which I mean theory I guess, taking it in its etymological sense of things we've seen, our own experiences. From a field, my own will be that an artwork, per definition, is a process of, again, detaching itself from where it emerges in order to be able to say anything about where it's emerging from. So it engages in a process of self-marginalization as an object, in such a way that it's hard for artists also not to do that. So there are a number of processes that counter the very possibility of inclusion theoretically, as again as an exercise of thought. How that then does not that shouldn't lead to the social reality of actual cultural exclusion, I think should be considered in relation to what the works themselves are. And in terms of the exercises or strategies that are taking place in some of the work that I myself am engaged in and elsewhere, which maybe start far away from the States, but ultimately also arrive here. I have to think of the work of colleagues in Lubumbashi, which is in Congo, where they've been taking methods of listening to the vocabularies that artists use, and one of them is the term kirata, which is a play on curator. So it's like a kirata in Kiswahili, which is no longer a curator who simply does the work that we know curators do, even though that's still also very obscure sometimes. But it's someone who helps an artist to write funding applications. So it's someone who's on the side of the artist at all times. So it's someone who accompanies the artist in the journeys that they need to make and take. And so I think maybe the terms and terminologies could be some of the ways to measure the inclusion and exclusion. But inclusion and exclusion is always maybe the point of contention of the center and margins of what the works of what an artwork is or wants to be. Sorry, that was too theoretical.
Yeah, just to say, like, I don't know if I'm interested in thinking so much about inclusion, exclusion. I appreciate that the impulse to resist those dialectics that you're bringing up, Christian. For me, it's much more about how we make space. And so I think in general, the system of art, which we all have our own relationships to, that we're engaged in, it does like a choreography of inclusion, whereby the standards, the languages have a tendency to homogenize. And so the question I have is like, not so much about, the demographics of who is in power and what inclusion that enables, because I'm not sure that always is most beneficial, neither for the public nor for the artist. But where is it that space is being able to be made? And that space may not be where it is that you're doing your work. It may not be in your museum. It may not be something that you're able to claim as a project of yours even. I'm interested in practitioners who are doing things like that. And that's where I feel like there's much more potential than sort of demographic, more Black curators now.
In terms of trying to measure marginalization, just to piggyback on what you just said, there's been this emphasis or focus in recent years at museums about canon correction. And it is assuming that there's a singular canon, though it's the contention of many curators that there are multiple canons, but how to figure out who's being excluded from what, it's a long-term project, I think. I think there is too much, there's a lot of emphasis and focus right now on doing this kind of reparative art history, though I'm skeptical about where that'll ultimately get us, and trying to identify what the limits of that are and who should actually be responsible for that work. Too often that responsibility lies on the shoulders of curators of color at different institutions to the exclusion of our peers who should also be doing that heavy lifting.
I was reminded of, like, in terms of metrics, I wrote down this thing about like when, and like, I guess, I don't know what year it was, but the made in LA that Hamza Walker and Arma Shayedi, 2016. Like, I went to the talk they did at MoCA, like, about when it was about to open, and they were someone raised their hand and they were like, how are you going to, like, make sure that the, like, there are enough women artists and enough artists of color in this exhibition? And they were like, you might not feel like there are enough, like, but we're trying to have a diversity of approaches and ideas in this show, and hopefully that also means there's a diversity of identities, but that's not our primary concern here, which was interesting, I think, even in that moment, because just think that's almost like 10 years ago, and it was like kind of controversial then for them to say that. But then I think that also in terms of like inclusion, I think that the thing that there's we're in a risky moment too, where there's like kind of like this emphasis on like bringing people into the canon, etc. But it's like these rather like homogenized, like, it's like, okay, like, let's get a bunch of Black people, but it's like maybe all figurative painters or something like that, and there's actually not a diversity of approach. And I think that, I know I've always thought about that moment in Hamza and Arm's presentation where they were like, it's just not going to work that way, because we're not going to end up with anything that's interesting if we just go by the numbers game. So I don't know, I just thought of that as well.
Great, thank you all. The other, one of the main objects of criticism in the theater of refusal is the practice of American art criticism. The words of the critics are printed on the walls. So I work as a critic. I guess I was wondering what seems at stake in criticism today for you all. I think I just saw Hilton Owls gave the the International Art Critics Association keynote on Wednesday at the New School. The whole talk was like the glory days of the New Yorker, being a staff writer, the Village Voice. Seemed really luxe. There are obviously constraints that one faced at that time. He fought tooth and nail to be able to write about Henry James. He was still he was talking about that in the catalog here. He was talking about that on Wednesday. But the Art Critics Association has released their inquiry into the conditions of labor for art critics, and it confirms what we all know. The prices have dropped out, word counts are shorter, print publishing is in free fall. I guess so. Today, if one was like taking stock of the critical landscape, like do reviews matter as much today? Are there other sources of criticism that seem to matter more? What do these things still feel determinative of the meaning of the work?
So I mentioned that I've been 8 years here, and I'm in the process of submitting a green card application, and you need a lot of. It would be great if I had. It's very helpful if you have a lot of reviews and criticism. So there is an actual material need for some artists to actually be able to function in the States. And I'm only mentioning green card, but it could also be for funding applications and all kinds of other necessities that make the very practice of art possible. So there's that aspect. But there is also the pedagogical dimension that you could delve into. and maybe a kind of translational aspect of maybe holding the artists and the curators and the institutions to account of whether what they're saying is happening in the exhibition actually is. So there's a type of dialogue and conversation that art criticism could do. I'm not sure if it does that, and at least to everyone's satisfaction, and maybe that's the very nature of criticism. But I think, yeah, it does have a place in at least in my life in that sense. But where exactly it is now, again, I'm not exactly sure. There could be a lot of things to be said about it. I think it trades in terms, it trades in at least if there's an American critique of an African exhibition, it will mostly be in terms of discovery and newness and kind of it. I'm not sure if it always does what it should do, and if it takes the kinds of responsibilities that it should take very seriously. Voila.
Yeah, I think that what I'm seeing, so I mean, like I make work, I've also operated as a critic here and there. I'm not sure if I am one right now, but I try to write about art. But I think that I feel like I'm seeing a lot of criticism now that seems like it's, I mean, I think that one, we do need critics and we need critics really badly, because I don't think anyone's going to get better at making art if they don't have, feedback. But I think that criticism right now feels like it's often kind of like, press release remixing or kind of like personal essay that sort of is like a meta critical thing about art that's like kind of like I saw some art, but here's something about me. And I think there's also a lot of increasingly, and I don't know if this is totally bad or not, but like kind of like generalists writing about art, like in, let's say, culture magazines or newspapers and things, like people who are like on a general culture beat than going and writing about art stuff. And I think that sort of leads to something that I thought was really interesting in the original roundtables and stuff, like the sort of question of like, how much does the art critic know or need to know to write about art, and leads to this question of theory as well. Because I really do think that, like, to me, an art critic should be using like historical theoretical tools that come from some portion of art history or the philosophies that undergird it. Otherwise, again, you end up with like someone writing a short, story about, or memoir about going to an exhibition. And I don't think that really cracks anything open. I think that like kind of leaving a lot on the table when that happens. So I think I see a lot of that. I think also like there's also a lot of like writing about exhibitions as a sort of like tugging on the like hem of someone's jacket to be like, hey, want to hang out? Like, we're writing, I mean, not even just in art, but kind of like in fashion and music, there's sort of this like Instagram networking kind of like mode of criticism as well. And I'm not sure how that gets fixed, but I think that it's a real problem, and you see it in the work and in the curating of exhibitions and in, and top to bottom in institutions to project spaces as well. So.
I mean, I think criticism is key in terms of helping to establish a historical record around an artist or around an exhibition. I think increasingly criticism functions in a very different way for institutions. For one, I think about how critics sometimes use the space of a review or something that they're writing to kind of push back or critique the institution, less what they're seeing or the artists. I think about some of the reviews of the New Museum Triennial, which I co-organized, which was around the time that the New Museum was dealing with its unionization push. And a lot of the critics responded to less to the show and more to that. And that's how the reviews were used. There's also this other thing that's happening at institutions where we haven't exactly recovered from 2020 in terms of attendance figures, and the criticism is becoming something for us to use to boost revenue. Like if people talk about the shows, then people will come. Sometimes it works, oftentimes it doesn't. I think when there's a focus on that, there's less to do. It has less to do with the artists, which is really in the work itself, which is really what the criticism should be focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been such a compression, right? I mean, of so many things, but criticism obviously very symptomatic of this ongoing compression, not only shorter word limits and so on, but to the point that you're talking about, Aria, of sort of Instagram critique, or where, you know, people kind of can now decide that they like a show more or less by what images they see, and that compression sort of goes even into innuendo, rumor, word of mouth, vibe, so to speak. So, you know, and I'm not really here to say that those are like necessarily bad ways to engage with work. I don't know. It's not my way, but I think that is like becoming a prevalent and acceptable mode of critique, and that's therefore something that we have to, you know, face and deal with. I draw some inspiration from the fact that like the exhibition that we're talking about was an artist-led, artist-initiated show. So like to remember that, and then to then call in the potentials for us as artists to bring critique into our practice, outside of, again, a space of judgment and outside of a space of good or bad. Like I think that this kind of it's a very narrow definition of criticism that we often deal with, which is a sort of like, you know, 5-star review or something. And I think artists can play a really important role in opening up how it is that we actually define that position of the critic.
Great, thanks. And maybe just do one more before we open it to the audience. The kind of two prongs of the exhibition are it's the newspaper critics and also the postmodern theory. It seems that you know, this exhibition takes place at Irvine, which is famously Derrida called it the capital of the state of theory. It's 93, and Gaines in his essay makes there's a good amount of reference to like Deleuze and Guattari. But the panelists, mostly when they're talking about theory, they're looking at African-American literary theory. They're not finding very much for them in the realm of art theory at the time. So it's Houston Baker, Henry Louis Gates Jr., Barbara Christian, Bell Hooks, but kind of before a lot of her classic works on visual culture have been written. Since then, I think, especially the 2010s, the 2000s and 2010s really saw, I think, a renaissance in Black critical theory, a lot at Irvine and at Riverside. I think the whole Afro-pessimist school that Aria talked about, Fred Moten, who's in the catalog, of course, Hartman in the 90s, but it has like an belated art world reception. So I guess I was wondering how, yeah, at the level of theory, what role does theory play in your practice as well? Because I also feel like very aware that we are in this kind of like, it's no longer peak efflux moment in art world discourse, but it does seem theory persists in some way, and Black theory has like a kind of new life and new predominance in art discourse.
Can I go? I guess I'll keep talking too much. Yeah, well, I use a lot of theory. I think I kind of made that clear maybe, but I think I try to use it more when I'm writing. I just read a lot of stuff because I like it, and then it makes its way into the objects. I wouldn't say that it's like the objects aren't like directly discursive in that way. But I think that, yeah, I think this thing that you point out and that was is so interesting. The fact that like one, there's almost like literary theory that's circulating in the Roundtable, and then two, even when you look at like these people who are kind of that 2000s, 2010s moment, that is a lot of the Black theory that we hear in the art world. A lot of those people are also coming from literature in one way or another, like, you know, Moten, poetry, Hartman, English, you know, English Department of Columbia, like Wilderson is also like a film and theater person. And I think I've become really interested in personally, I don't really know what to do with it, but the fact that there is, I mean, there are a lot of like really great Black art historians, of course, who we probably are reading, but like the sort of like writing theory about art, like from like, you know, from like using Black studies and not just commuting stuff from other like Black artistic practices and other disciplines, is like there's this kind of weird gap that I, at least that I've found, and I would love to know if people know sources that I don't, but I am curious about that. But I think that feels increasingly important to me because I do think that like with all this interest in Black art, and I think let's just say with an interest in like marginality, et cetera, overall, but also like a rapidly shifting like economic and political situation, I just feel like there has to, and with the art world being what it is, like there has to be, that stuff has to happen and that work has to be done, because it's just everything's getting too confusing, or and it also becomes very easy to be lazy in terms of like using like a 1970s framework of like what like, you know, conceptual art is and does, like, and then just using that in 2024, we just know that doesn't work. And so I think that like Black studies has a lot to offer to sort of provide correctives in that regard, and also forge like new ways of thinking about things. But by and large, it's not happening, which returns also to the problem of criticism, and also I think also an overall a weird anti-intellectualism as well. I think in the art world, as people have been privileging personal history, like expression, et cetera. I think people who are working in a more theoretical registers are kind of, like I would say, let's say, just like using myself as an example, I feel like often when I'm like, oh, like this is this philosophy, people are like, whoa, like it's got to be about you, babe, and I'm like, okay, like, well, it is, but so yeah, that's my
Yeah, I mean, I have a degree in art semiotics. You know, I did a lot of theory, a lot of post-structuralist theory in school, and I feel like I more or less spent like the rest of my life after college trying to unlearn a lot of that. You know, there was so much work I had to do to try to, first of all, understand it, and then second of all, see whether and how it understood me. I got somewhere with the first. With the second, you know, I felt like it mostly wasn't engaging neither with Blackness, nor, you know, maybe with some exceptions to this in Guattari. There are some exceptions, but engaging with embodiment, questions of embodiment. The people who I feel like were speaking to me, you know, in more recent times, were mostly black theoreticians, and mostly people who took a much more poetic or open-ended approach to the way that they wrote. Gums, Moten for sure. So I think that, you know, one of my mentors, I talked before about Tony Coates, you know, like a lot of his early work got kind of panned for being too theoretical. And like there was this kind of shut up and dribble sort of aspect to the idea, like, you know, you're an artist, you're not the one who's supposed to be producing discourse in your literal work. Like you're the one who's supposed to be the object of discourse. And I'm glad he stuck with it, and I felt like there was something instructive in that for me, as you know, I was a student in college, because I also found that with dance there was also a kind of shut up and dribble approach to it. It was like dance is not supposed to. We don't want intellectual. Like we are thinking subjects. We want to come for a fully embodied experience. That is like completely non-critical, right? And I reject it. I reject that, actually, even the distinction of mind body, like that, like on a very fundamental level. You know, like my whole work is about rejecting that. So yeah, I feel like this is where I'm going to end and pass it on.
Yes, there is always a sense that you have to excuse yourself if something is too theoretical in the space of contemporary art, and maybe some of it is merited though. Often, at least in my own trajectory, I found things like positionality, where I just really wanted to say position, and so I think there is a need to calibrate and speak at the readiness of the listener. So I think there's a need to, and then these are not my words, it's Lawrence Abu Hamdan's beautiful term. And so I think as artists slash occasional critics slash whatever else we do, there is a need to also maybe think a little bit about what we actually really want. Do we want our work to be understood? Do we want the work to actually exist outside of the realms of where it's made and presented? Do I want my grandmother to get it? Or the likes of them. It's not to say that my grandmother is not theoretical. It's just that she might have completely other concerns at a particular time, and so I think there is a need to be maybe a bit more in dialogue and attentive to what we want the work to do. There's a lot of pleasure in being very complicated, and ascending to a level of thought that we find in the authors and writers and books we love, who spend years and years crafting the words and making them available through publications. And then there's another dimension where we are expected to read them. The word, I think the American term will be consume them, and then master them, like as though we wrote them, but we haven't. And so I think there's that aspect where it's not always so easy and so possible to fully operate at the theoretical level that an MA student is expected to do. And once you've done that, yes, you kind of want to unlearn it a little bit, but then it shouldn't be dismissed either. So I think it's a kind of it's a useful balance that shouldn't just be taken for granted. But yes, and then there's the kind of, as you mentioned, the kind of the Twitter, Instagram art top 100 or so, that also needs to happen for different reasons. And so I think there are different spectrum that intersect in these questions of the role of theory in visual arts. Yeah.
In terms of my orientation to theory, I'm a sifter and a translator so that artists can do what they want to do and speak in the language that they want to speak. And then I have to do the work of translating that for an audience, for a public, which is very difficult. My training was in philosophy and cultural studies, and I've had to also break that apart in my brain in order to make it useful, not just to myself, but also to people that are encountering my work as a curator and the work of the artists that I work with. I think it's still a useful tool. I thought it was very interesting that the Roundtable respondents were like, yeah, I take what I want and I discard it, which I don't discard anything. I just try to find a different language so that I can talk to the public, whoever that public is and wherever they're coming from, to make it accessible, to make the work of the institution accessible. If there's one thing that I like to think is that generosity is a nice strategy. And if you have, if you have an orientation towards theory where you're absorbing it, you're using it, you're adding a lot of density to your work, that's totally fine. That's valid. But I think also being generous to an audience that might not have that training is also a radical idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I struggle with in terms of like the question of like address and accessibility, because I've had many experiences. I mean, I think like I tend towards just saying things the way that I would say them, which tends towards a more theoretical language. I try not to use like jargon, but like that's what my training is in and how my brain works and whatever. And I found that like often if I just express myself in a way that's like authentic to like how I'm thinking about things, people of various backgrounds, whether they're like people who wandered in off the street and like saw there was like a panel and like whatever, or like are people who are trained, like people like have responded well from various backgrounds. And so I've become very wary of trying to know my audience. And I think also as an artist, you have maybe there is like a privilege of doing that and having the buffer of the curators and the institutions to then assist where there is assistance needed. But I think that like it's been, yeah, I think I've kind of like try to really keep like I can't work other people's side of the street. Like it's like I kind of have to just do what I'm gonna do and like let that be. And if I'm interested in theory and that's what drives my practice, then like I kind of have to like live with that or like get out of Dodge or something. I think like, and I think recently I've been like, well, okay, like I love making work, but I'm also like, I feel like I don't like maybe I'm not actually like, so maybe I shouldn't be trying to do some of the things like with exhibitions or like making my work accessible to others. Like maybe I should just like go write a book or something like for like a smaller audience, because it's like if there's like this sort of if there's somehow a tension between expressing like delving into theory and making objects and just like doing that, I don't know, I'm just kind of like, well, I'd rather just like go do the theory or something. But I don't really think that there's like, I don't know, I guess like there's just like this like always this like weird push and pull that I don't totally understand from my like just from where I stand. I don't get why there's like this like maybe we shouldn't have to, or we shouldn't talk in these ways and like whatever.
I just want to be clear that it's not about dumbing things down for the audience. I think it's really important that we continue to challenge audiences, and if that's introducing theoretical ideas, that's great. Like none of us should have to feel that we have to do either or in order to do our work successfully and to speak to audiences successfully.
Great. I think we have time for a few audience questions. Is there a mic for the audience? Great.
Hi. This is sort of like a halfway formulated question, so forgive me if it's a little rambly. But I guess sort of in response to two things, the first of which was said by Jamila, but just a question about, I guess I'm thinking about Dean Kissick's recent piece in Harper's Monthly, The Painted Protest. And like, I don't really want to get into like discourse around that, but just like, also I haven't really read it. So I read like half of it. But I'm just thinking about this idea that like institutions could or should be responsible for reacting to or reflecting the political concerns of like a divided society, and like this question of like value in art like being rooted in their effectiveness at doing that. Like, is there, I don't know, is it realistic to think also that like there's still a way of engaging art that places a question on its like aesthetic value maybe over its necessary political relevance? And I'm also like feeling shy now because we all laughed at me mentioning that article, so but yeah, anyway. Should we gather maybe a few questions?
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this panel. This is a question, I don't know, maybe for Kieran or maybe even Charles. I'm kind of curious about the original exhibition and what the kind of relationship was between the critical text presented and the works of art. So if the criticism was like direct references or more of a general kind of critical ambiance or reception. And I was also kind of thinking about maybe one of the hallmarks of postmodern art being a kind of breakdown of artwork and criticism, and if there's was a suggestion that as opposed to a dichotomy, there might be some kind of synthesis in the exhibition. So maybe more of a historical question.
Cool. We have to take one more, and then.
Hi. I'm going to bring the international back into the room and go back to what Christian had said earlier in regards to does where you're from make you kind of like a harder subject to be criticized? I'm intrigued by that question and have space to debate it outside of this, but I wanted to maybe position that in the locality of if you are an international person in a city, we're in New York, right? I'm from London. Is there a position where you would perceive it more important for the person to be criticized by an American critic versus an international critic, or even my heritage is Jamaican, a Jamaican critic? So yeah, what is the locality of the exhibition's importance to the criticism that is at hand and the voice at hand?
Great, thank you. If perhaps maybe Charles or Catherine or Rhea would want to answer Alex's question about the specific function of the text in the work, or the relationship of those texts to those works. Is there a microphone? Thanks.
There wasn't much direct relationship between the texts that were quoted and stuck on the wall and the works in the show. I hope the general impression in that show was the fact that the texts, which were mostly written by sort of local newspaper rags and short reviews in art magazines, that the texts were both irrelevant to the work and dismissive of the artists, and tenaciously uninformed about what the artists were actually doing. And those charts that you saw on the wall, at that point, I had like a mini fleet of grad students. So it was possible to just hand people like the artists' bio packets and get them to sort of map out the ways in which artists were completely ignored and for how long. And it was really that kind of demographic. I mean, and part of the point of highlighting those texts was to just demonstrate how horrible they were. I mean, how you probably shouldn't accept them from even like a first-year undergraduate. You just shouldn't write anything that's stupid and be paid to print it. I mean, it was staggering. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, and I hope that what you come away with is that New York had a lot of bad writers and critics, because I mean, if you read that stuff, the most unbelievable things are being said about the artists, and Catherine's right that the purpose of that is to reveal that the critical language that's being used to talk about art might have functioned okay for writing about white art, but its poverty as a form of communication showed up when they started to talk about black art.
Thank you. Any of the panelists like to speak to that question, or the painted protest, or the national location of the critic?
I mean, I could maybe link a little bit what was just spoken to with the first question, without speaking at any length or giving any more space to Dean. I think that for me, like, I'll say one thing that I appreciated about that article was that it just kind of reinforced a feeling that I've been having, which is that I kind of grew up through art assuming that it was somehow a leftward venture, that we were, however, in disagreement, at least in a kind of progressive ideal together. That article reinforced something I've been feeling, which is that that's no longer the case. That art is can no longer be claimed by the left or by progressives or make us feel good about ourselves or whatever, and is maybe more democratic and also maybe more terrible because of that. So I don't encounter, as you had to deal with, I don't encounter so much just bad writing, like stupid bad criticism, but I do encounter a lot of stupid ideas, like ideals, and that article was a great example of that.
Can I say something to piggyback on that? I think like it's been interesting, and again, not to give too much airtime, but like I think it's actually a great object lesson for kind of, problem things. So it's like also rather than there being, like, okay, 1,000 leftist critiques or stories of the last 10 years spring forth after Dean's thing. Instead, there's like this, like, like frenzy about like that one guy said that it's this. And like, it kind of also shows the breakdown of like the critical landscape where like, if there were more magazines that could pay people and like had editors who were like smart and also paid, and et cetera, we could have like by now 6 other pieces that weren't just like, this is why Dean is bad, but like we're like, here's like a from the left, like a story of like how actually the market and the internet and like, yes, like some, good ideas about wanting, like we could have a story about like how things have come to be what they are, but instead it's like, boo Dean, which is a real waste of everyone's intellectual energies to like have to have that conversation a million times. But
So in response to the question of internationalism, but maybe first to the last question. I haven't read the article it was in Harper. So I think maybe the location of the critic, of course, also includes not just the geographic aspect, but maybe also where that criticism is published. So I'm not sure how much attention should be given to the criticism of Harper, towards the arts. I don't know. I'm not maybe equipped enough to know or to give it like as much care. At the same time, it has such a wide readership that maybe shouldn't be just dismissed or relegated to whoever gets to be published there. But I think there's something fundamentally corrupt about those positions in such a way that maybe I get to read them only now because I have heard about it in this room. So that's one location, maybe. Another one, I had to think of, since you mentioned London, of the texts, the Cobbina Mercer's texts, the burden of representation, Black artists and the burden of representation, which had similar concerns to theater refusal in terms of engaging with a criticism, a review, a reflection on many other criticisms of an exhibition gathering at the Hayward Gallery at the time, gathering Black artists, which also means artists not just of African descent, but at the time, Black meant quite a number of positions of people of color. And I think that article is interesting in maybe responding to what the difficulties can be, in relation again to whether an artist, a black artist can simply just make art, please, and just not have any additional adjectives to it. And it's proven rather exhausting to do, and also exhausting to simply even have to defend. But unfortunately, there's often again, years later, decades later, there still is an expectation that somehow, there's a need for an artist of international character or so to bring more than what is what is localized, and to some extent, I think the kinds of attractions I have to that position is that, yes, there's often something far more social, cultural, political that might be happening beyond what is visible or present within the room. But I think that's also true for most artists. And an example of that, I guess, would be like the last documenta, where you really, I think that was quite centralized in novel ways, at least at that scale. But I think the again, so the localized critic has most of the time little, or they make little effort or interests, or simply are unequipped to deal with the extent of the connections, of the reach, of the dimensions that a work is engaging in, because of the kind of vocabularies, references, that an international artist might have to work with. In my own case, I work a lot with philosophers who mostly speak French, and so I spend a lot of time translating, just as a need and necessity to be able to talk to colleagues who speak in English, and but that in itself already puts a limit on who can actually truly critique the work, because it exists only in French. And so that's simply one example. So there exist a number of those that, because of the legacies of how the world was divided by sometimes the British and the French or the Belgians who spoke certain languages, that those divisions somehow persists within our midst. And I think that culturally has a lot of ramifications, and that's not only a linguistic problem. I think it's also a set of references and orientations, aspirations that are simply not available to the critics here, who might have a need for something that they themselves can refer to in a way that I think Ariadne mentioned, that just brings something of themselves in the text instead of maybe spending more time with the work. Yeah, I will think more about it.
Any other responses to questions? Otherwise, I think this concludes the panel. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much to Charles and Catherine, especially Rhea, Janilla, Eric Stone, all the panelists. Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly add, well, thank you. That was incredible. And thank you, Charles and Catherine, for joining in. And the galleries will be open until 6:15, including the North Gallery across the terrace. So please do hang out, take a look around, and don't forget to pick up your copy of the book in the back. Thank you all.
Yes.